Welcome to Out of the Question, a podcast that looks behind some common questions and uncovers the question behind the question while providing real solutions for biblical world and life view. Your co-hosts are Andrea Schwartz, a teacher and mentor, and Pastor Charles Roberts.
Thanks for tuning in. Let me start off by saying that I did not watch the Olympics, or I should say I didn't watch it voluntarily, because sometimes there were TV screens going in places I showed up and, my eye glanced and I could see that there was some sort of competition going on. But by and large, I, like many other people, didn't watch the Olympics. And I recently saw a friend's social media post marking himself safe from watching the Olympics. Now, Some might not get the humor behind it because customarily people will use this type of post to let others know they were not harmed by a tornado, flood, or earthquake. Whether or not one watched the Olympics, there was plenty of activity surrounding a number of aspects of the 2024 event, which, to use the word I saw most commonly, was the outrage of many people. So let's go to the dictionary. Webster's 1828 dictionary defines outrage thusly: injurious violence offered to persons or things, excessive abuse, wanton mischief, rude, abusive language, scurrility, or opprobrious and contemptuous words may be an outrage to persons or to decency and civility. A violent attack upon person or property is an outrage. So many were apparently outraged by the opening ceremonies and certain events which involved men posing as women, beating up or beating real women in boxing competitions. The question Charles and I will be discussing today isn't so much about the Olympics, although it will obviously touch upon it, is this: is being outraged a service to the kingdom of God? What do you think, Charles? Is it enough to be outraged?
I think it's an understandable reaction on one level, but really I'm tempted to ask the question. I'm just going to go ahead and ask it. Why the outrage? I mean, it's like, you put lipstick on a pig and the pig goes and jumps right back in the mud. Why are you surprised? That's what they do. What we saw on display and what generated the outrage, as you just described, was the opening ceremony, and to a lesser extent perhaps, but it was just as outrageous with the closing ceremony, which is the only part of it I happen to see. Whether you're looking at something like that or the previous opening ceremonies from previous years, it's all part of the same humanistic man is God and will decide for himself what is good and bad, right or wrong. I went back and saw a reference, or somebody posted a reference. I wondered if it had been photoshopped to make it look like this, but it was supposedly, I think it was the 2012 London Olympics, what the year was. It was a fairly recent one, and it was in London. And I went back and saw the entire 3-hour opening ceremony. It was available on YouTube, because in the clip that I was seeing on one of the social media pages, they were remarking that the opening ceremony of that Olympiad so many years ago involved hundreds of hospital beds with little children in them. And there was this giant, massive statue of, death with the long black cape and the hollowed out, headpiece carrying the sheath. But what I saw was indeed that there were all these nurses pushing hospital beds around the stadium floor with kids in them, which was kind of an odd thing. But if you can go back further than that, and you can see whether you're talking about a very early Olympiad or even the most outrageous recent one, there's a progressive step in what Dr. Rustuni and Van Til called people becoming epistemologically self-conscious. So when you start with the premises that the modern Olympics, or even the ancient one, they're both pagan, what they start with, eventually you wind up with what we saw in the opening ceremony and the closing ceremony most recently. And yes, it is outrageous.
Right. But is being outraged enough is really the question. And the reason I bring it up is because Christians especially seem to be surprised when pagans act like pagans, when heathens act like heathens, and they are definitely outraged over it. So the question is, would you even know it had taken place if you hadn't watched it? Why do people watch the Olympics? I suspect for Christians, movies like Chariots of Fire or Olympians who give testimony to their love for Jesus Christ make people think, well, then it's okay to watch and participate because, look, people who were Christians took a stand. But is that the benchmark of how we should spend our time and our efforts? And is being outraged that this happened and talk about how outrageous it is and was, does it do anything to further the kingdom of God?
Yeah, and the answer, in my opinion, is no. Outrage is not enough, because we find that, as you mentioned, most people would not have any kind of reaction to this whatsoever, except that they saw it on television. And that becomes part of a much larger looming problem that has been described as a component of what's called fifth generation warfare, where we are being manipulated and controlled by things like what we see on television. And it's not haphazard, it's intentional. So what happens with these types of cycles, whether it be something related to politics, or in this case, the Olympics, or something cultural, something like this will be forced to the surface of people's awareness. They will be excited, outraged, sad, whatever the case may be, and then we move on to the next cycle of propaganda, or whatever sort of eye candy is dangled in front of our faces. And in the end, we just keep on a cycle of this thing over and over and over again, to the detriment of the forward movement of God's kingdom, or what I should say is our responsibility for moving the kingdom of God forward. Because again, if all we're doing is sitting around being ticked off about what we saw, that's not really accomplishing what the Lord sent us out to do in making the nations his disciples.
Exactly. The interesting thing is, what becomes this unifying force that the whole world is watching? See, the Olympics is supposed to be, let's forget about our differences. We're all one people. Everybody's the same. We are the world. And so it really promulgates a one world idea. Now, I think you and I have talked privately about this. If I'm watching a sporting event and I know nothing about what it takes to be good at that event or the people who are participating, why should I like the United States person better than a French person? Well, because you see, it's this idea that I'm an American. So we have these illusions of patriotism and participation and everybody's welcome. And then this Olympic committee, whoever they are, become nameless people who have tremendous power to give a gold medal or a silver medal or a bronze medal to someone. And I doubt there's very much gold, silver, or bronze in any of the medals currently. The point being is, we get wrapped up and we become participants in a movie, which by and large doesn't honor God, doesn't acknowledge God. And so instead of saying, this is outrageous, they should know better, really, maybe it's intentional. And the observation is, well, they've taken it for so many years, we can give our audiences whatever we want to give them.
In anticipation of us talking about this, I decided to make a presentation on this, more or less the same subject, to my church Sunday evening Bible study this past Sunday. And I kept thinking of a lecture that Dr. Restuni gave, and I think it was also printed in not one of his books, but in a collection of essays and articles by a number of other clergy from many, many years ago. But you'll find it on the chalcedon.edu website. It's called The United Nations, A Religious Dream. And when you see the sort of stuff being promoted in the modern Olympics, even going back to the beginning of it in the early 1900s, especially in recent years, it looks to be almost the same sort of agenda. So I did a little bit of research, and I found that the man who is the current head of the International Olympic Committee made several speeches to a number of the prominent United Nations committees about how the Olympics are following the Agenda 2030 of the United Nations. And he was very proud of the fact that the current Olympics was one of the first to try to achieve parity between 50% female, 50% male, transgendered, all of the sort of things that are characteristic of our current woke culture. And it is very much a handmaiden of the religious dream of the United Nations, as Dr. Rushdoony called it. So that's something else that people need to realize. And I'll say whether we're talking about Olympics or even professional sports just in the United States or in other countries that are signed on to this sort of thing. When you see the athletes on that team, or whether it's an American Olympic team or whatever, you're probably not seeing the best of the best. You're seeing those who met a certain criteria to be included because of a social and largely humanistic, atheistic political agenda. And so that's another thing that gives a lie to what it purports to give. On the other hand, it is very much in the tradition, the modern Olympics, with the original games, which were pagan and extremely violent from top to bottom and from beginning to end.
I mentioned the movie Chariots of Fire, and the whole idea of one character going to the Olympics and hiring a professional trainer. It was said, no, this goes against the whole idea of the amateur, the one who loves the sport and just does it. Well, the current Olympics had the superstars from the NBA representing the American team, the top golfers in the world, professional golfers representing their respective countries. So it just really becomes a showcase. And I think what it does is it elevates sports to a level where the regular rules do not apply. And I'll give you an example. Let's just take the sport of boxing in general. If two people at the local mall where you live were hauling off against each other, the police would be called and they might both be arrested, and then it would be adjudicated who did what to whom. But when we call the sport boxing, and we can watch one person level punches to someone's head, no doubt giving them multiple concussions, we call that a sport. And there are judges who will go ahead and grade them as to who delivered the better punches. So what might be considered assault and battery outside the ring is a sport inside the ring. So what were people among the outrages about? Well, first of all, they should be outraged that there's a women's sport, boxing, where women are pounding each other. And they should be outraged that there's a men's sport, boxing, where people are pounding each other, because this is not the second great commandment lived out, for sure. But they were outraged because a man saying he was a woman was punching other women. And so they were like, it's just not fair to that woman that she's being pounded on by a man. Talk about why we call our podcast Out of the Question. It's because people are usually asking the wrong questions. And that's a really good example. Should a man be allowed to box a woman? From a Christian perspective, is that why God created women to pound on each other?
Yeah. Should women be boxing, period? Or I'll even go one step beyond and ask the question, should men be boxing? Fist fighting for self-defense purposes or hand-to-hand combat or whatever. I mean, these are a part of human life on occasion. Sadly, we have to defend ourselves. Maybe we have other ways of doing that. But to turn it into sport, that's again, I think, shows the pagan roots. I mean, when you look at the original Olympics, it included what we call a type of boxing, but it was far more brutal. And it approaches something like the cage fighting that we see today, although what the ancient Greeks were doing in the Olympics makes cage fighting look tame. But this is not going to stay where it is. I mean, I can still remember, maybe you can too. I forgot which Olympiad it was, but at the time, I think George Foreman was an amateur boxer. And it was a time, I think, pretty close to the civil rights era, and there was a lot of tension between white folks and African Americans, et cetera. And he won this particular Olympic boxing match, and he went around each corner with an American flag. And he did kind of a little bow with that American flag. What pride. I mean, that was just an amazing moment, But the larger point is, what is this all about to begin with? What is it about for people to come together and engage in these type of activities? I mean, on a maybe dressed down scale, there's nothing wrong with, say, people at a church or family gathering engaging in some type of athletic competition. But on the other hand, what's the purpose of it? And I think you can see from the very beginning of the modern Olympics, and even going back to the earliest Olympics, where sacrifices were made to the god Zeus, and the priests of Zeus carried on around with chanting and doing all kinds of fire-related sacrificing of bulls, and it was just a whole production. And it looks a whole lot, or is getting to look a whole lot like what we're seeing with the modern Olympic ceremonies. But when you look at what Scripture prescribes for God's people about what we are to be about doing, this kind of stuff is nowhere on the radar screen. And it's like, well, you're just being a sourpuss, a spoil sport. Why you can't watch a good athletic competition? That's not what we're saying. But what we are saying is that so much time and energy, and in this case, outrage, is expended on this stuff, when in the end, is this really what the Lord calls us to be about doing in terms of being active members of His kingdom?
Right. I'm sure people are more outraged at the fact that a woman was pounded on by a man, and then we'll have all sorts of explanations. Is he really a man? Was he born with this anomaly? Blah, 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 blah. Than they are about children being murdered in utero down the street from them.
Right.
So I sometimes think that there are the outrage police who want to give the sheep opportunities to be outraged. So more recently, or I should say previously, there was the whole controversy in the NC2A about transgender women competing against regular women. Okay, so let's get all the terminology. A man saying he was a woman started competing in female swimming competitions, and guess what? He won. So he was like 450th ranked in terms of when he was competing as a male. Now he's competing as a female, and he wins. So people are upset because these girls, and one of the prominent spokespersons were like, do you know how much I sacrificed my entire life getting up at 4 a.m, swimming before school, swimming after school, not having time with my friends, devoting everything to this sport? And people go, yeah, that's just so bad. She was robbed. Was she robbed, or was she robbing God? She was spending all her time trying to beat certain times in the pool, and we're supposed to say she's a hero because of it. I looked at this person and said, well, she's significantly misguided. Number one, why should I care more about a girl who gets up at 4 a.m. to swim in a pool so she can win competitions than the mother who's got 2 jobs and she's getting up at 4 a.m. to do her first job? You see, sports becomes this arena where everything sort of is okay. And we don't ask the question, well, sweetie, why did you do this? And if you did it all for a medal, doesn't that sort of fall under the category of having an idol? I don't know. Am I off base here, Charles?
No, I don't think so at all. And it again is a part of the self-consciousness of those people whose starting point is the word of man versus the word of God. Because if we follow the biblical worldview as opposed to whatever in the world we call the worldview of the Olympics and the current world culture, you end up with what you're describing. Guys pretending to be women and punching women in the face, and women who have somehow missed the prescription for what it means to be a woman given in God's law word, which means raising children, being the co-regent of the household with the husband. That's the prescription that God has roles for men and women. And beating the daylights out of each other in professional boxing matches is not part of it. And it shows that who the God is of these people. They may be nice people, but when you follow that path, it eventually takes you to a certain direction where you get what they got. I at one level, you certainly understand the angst of these girls, or this one girl who was beat out by the guy at the swimming contest, but on the other hand, it's like you said, why the outrage? What did you expect? You're dealing with a group of people and an organization, whether it's based in the United States or the Olympic Committee or whoever. This is the direction they're going. And I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast, that one of the curious and disturbing elements of ancient esoteric occultism was the complete elimination of male and female and the merging of both into this sort of sexless, androgynous, android type, being. And that's something else you see slowly but surely being worked into this picture. And another thing, it's gotten very, very, very difficult for people, I think, to ignore the profoundly pagan religious significance attached to these type of gatherings. And in doing the research that I did for the presentation I made to my church the other night, I came across an article that was talking about the UN's Earth Charter. And they had once they put this thing together about, Gaia and Mother Earth and all this climate stuff, and I'm being purposely dismissive. I know there's a lot more to it than that, but where I'm going with it is that, and this goes back maybe 15, 20 years, maybe. They actually took this charter, these documents, and they put it inside of this large box-like structure that was made to look exactly like the Ark of the Covenant. And they had the poles running down either side of it, and they carried it around. You can find this information online about this. And then you fast forward to these Olympic Games where you saw similar kinds of ritualistic, weird kind of ceremonies at the beginning and at the end. And it reminds me, if I may do so, quote Numbers from the book of Numbers, chapter 25, where the Israelites, it says, aligned itself with the Baal or Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and execute them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that his burning anger may not turn away from Israel. So these people had gotten involved in the ritual worship of other gods. Now, in the case of these people, it was through getting sexually involved with pagan women. So whatever the lure is, it's going to take God's people down the wrong path if they aren't cautious and turn away from these things.
So sport, just by the name sport, it's something you do for leisure. It's something you do that's a digression from what you normally do. So there would be work and then there would be sports. But in our day and age, sports has become a professional goal. And I can't tell you, Charles, how many young people that I have had the opportunity to mentor. And I ask them why they choose certain things. Why do they want to go to public high school? Well, because they have good sports. Okay, tell me why you want to be in the sports. I just want to hear people cheering for me. I think there is a positive value in sports, learning how to compete, learning how to follow rules, learning that in every competition, there's going to be a winner and a loser. And that's a good thing because you know what? In life, sometimes you win or sometimes you succeed and sometimes you don't. So it's a very valuable thing in terms of building character. But when it becomes obsession, and you see it a lot of times with parents pushing their children into, you're going to be doing this. You must practice. Sorry, you can't go out and go to a movie or you can't go to the beach because you must practice your sport. Then we have vicarious living from parents through their children. And the whole thing moves out of the realm of character building and learning some of the basics in life. And then it becomes the focal point. And I'm convinced that most public schools wouldn't even be there if it wasn't for sports. That's the draw. That's what keeps their doors open and everybody thinking that, well, we should support the public schools.
Yeah, and that's a major conduit for how the humanistic government school systems try to maintain and keep control and corrupt Christian schools that seek to be biblical. In another state where I used to live, and I'm pastor of a church in this state, and one of the church members of the church where I was, he and his family had come to us from another church where they had a Christian school. And these people were very self-consciously modeling a standard of Christian education that they frankly learned from Dr. Rustuni and Gary North and a number of other people that we like. And they had to deal with what you just described. Well, I'd like to go to school there, but you don't have any sports. Oh yeah, we do. We have, intramural. You this eighth grade plays this grade. No. I want to be able to play the big high school down the road and that sort of thing. So they get in touch with these organizations that maintain the school system, sporting events or whatever it is. And yeah, well, we'd like to let you into that, but you'd have to apply here and you'd have to agree to these principles. And that's down the path to corruption. There is, in the area where I live, a large Christian school. It's been around for many, many years, and they have this huge stadium like you'd see at a public school for football. And I've talked to numerous people who have said they've sent their children to this place, and I said, really, I mean, it's just like going to public school, but they have a Bible on the desk, and that's about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so we get co-opted into thinking, well, then we can be a good witness. That holds just about as much water as the people who say, I send my children to public school so they can be missionaries.
Yeah.
No, they end up being the captives, and they are converted. And in many cases, the best conversion is one where you don't realize you've been converted. You still think, oh, yes, I'm a Christian, but then there are all these other things that you agree to. But let's go back to the whole idea of sports and women. I saw an article recently, and it demonstrated how our modern sports and how you train for them and how you carry things out during a game are not really conducive to women's anatomy and physiology. So the standard is what works for men. Well, let's be stating the obvious. Women have a monthly occurrence that prepares them or is an indication that they are able to bear children. In sports, that's a detriment to women. I can tell you this from knowing people who participate. It ends up being something that makes it difficult during that time of the month to be at your best. And so when women train and train and train and their body fat composition goes down, well, in some cases, that monthly occurrence doesn't happen anymore. Similarly to how women in concentration camps or prisoner of war camps during World War II stopped having their periods. So is it healthy for women to go through these metabolic changes in order to be very good at their sport and the potential of it compromising their fertility later on? Just the same way that if you're going to participate in sports and you're going to travel around the world and you're going to meet different people, maybe it's a good idea to be on some sort of birth control. Not so much because you hate children, but, getting pregnant right now would really mess up my professional sports or my amateur sports career. So once again, women get co-opted into thinking that this is the right thing to do when, if you take a look at like women's soccer players, their knees are always compromised, regularly compromised. They have knee issues. Well, because the kind of training regimen that they do doesn't hold up the same way a man's physical attributes would. So everybody knows that there's a huge difference between a man and a woman. Everybody really does know what is a woman, but we've made it such a way that people grasp for things that actually are detrimental to them.
Yeah, the point you brought up just now, I was speaking with someone recently about that, and I was wondering out loud if, and you may or may not know the answer, I don't know, in terms of the intensive training that some women or many women do who prepare for things like the Olympics or other professional soccer, whatever it may be, when the menstrual cycle stops. Has anybody done any kind of medical survey or study of that to say what is the long-term effect of this being a habitual thing, just month after month after month after year?
I'm not aware of it. I'm sure somebody has, but we'd be hard-pressed to find the results because that's not part of the narrative.
Right.
But
yeah.
I remember, just to kind of make a joke of it, so my girls were involved in golf. And in some tournaments, you were able to have somebody who would caddy for you. And so a family friend would go ahead and do it. Well, one hot day in the Central Valley of California, there was one of these qualifying tournaments that allowed people to have a caddy. This one girl shows up with long black pants on. Now, the man who was caddying for my daughter was like, what is wrong with that person? I mean, doesn't she know that it's 100 degrees out right now? What's her problem? Boy, she's an idiot. Well, every girl who heard him say that knew exactly why she was in long black pants. Because if you're in a short white golf skirt and you end up having what all girls know about, an accident, then not only do you probably have to stop playing, but it's a huge embarrassment. But that never even crossed his mind because you see, that's not something that men have to deal with. So in actual fact, the whole idea of feminism and we have to be equal to men in all respects, instead of celebrating how we're not the same, women co-opted themselves in order to go after a carrot, which they never would get anyway. So you and I have spoken about the media campaign that got women to start smoking. Why did they try to promote women smoking? Because they were missing 50% of the population. Well, women started smoking. Interestingly enough, health problems that women usually were not experiencing, they started to catch up with men because now they were doing some of the same detrimental things in terms of health and wellness. So congratulations, you caught up. But for what end? Are people truly happier because they can swim 0.05 of a second faster than the next person? Will that make a difference in terms of life and finding happiness in family life and children? It's like, it's such a false prize that it's not a surprise that, you know, the medals were shiny and gold and whatever, because people were going for something that really wasn't real.
Yeah, and sooner or later, these challenges that, and in this case, we're talking about women in professional athletics and sports, or any other endeavor that may involve men or women, what are perceived from the modern standpoint are as the limitations of being human. There again, that sort of revs up this drive to go beyond being human and to come up with something that's not really human and not really, or some sort of strange, new sexless entity that doesn't have to worry about any of this stuff. And you wind up with the idea of androids and robots, half human, half machine. I mean, this is where these people think, and this, as outrageous as it may seem to someone, it's no more outrageous than somebody telling somebody 50 years ago that you'll one day tune into a television show about the Olympics and they're worshiping the devil in the opening ceremony. People would never believe that 50 years ago, but yet here we are. So once people cast off the model that the Lord established in his creation, then, we can look at the technocracy that we have today to get some idea of where it's going, but we don't really have to look even here. We can look back to the ancient pagans to see that they were about the same thing. But even there, some of them had a little bit better understanding about the place of men and women. In the original Olympics, women were not only not allowed to compete, they weren't even, well, let me back up. Married women were not allowed to attend the original Olympics in ancient Greece because the men competed naked. Except I think I read somewhere that prostitutes were allowed to attend because that might be the reward for some of the, men who won competitions. And also I read somewhere that the original Olympics is a myth, that everything stopped, every war and conflict in the ancient world stopped so everybody could come to Mount Olympus and the great temple of Zeus and watch the Olympic Games in a spirit of peace. Yeah, that's a lot of baloney. It never happened. The games went forward, but if there was a war or conflict going on, they didn't just stop and go sit around in some ideal situation. They continued seeking after territory or whatever it was that motivated the conflict. So it's understandable, as I said, that people would be outraged at what they perceive to be as an insult to their biblical faith and their biblical understanding of things. But it raises the question, especially for those who participate in these things and regularly watch them and promote them, really, is this what the Lord wants us to be about? I don't think so.
Yeah. So the question is, all right, so I understand the sentiment. I have a good friend who took great pains to write to all her friends, giving us the name and address of the president of the Olympic Committee, where we should write a letter of protest. Now, I had to smile because, oh yeah, all that took place happened and he didn't know about it. He's going to be so grateful to get my letter. This is intentional. Even having a controversy about these things makes you wonder, our attention is being drawn here. What's happening over here that maybe we should pay attention to? And so instead of the necessity of having a reaction to this outrage, the real question is, what do you do day in and day out to counter those things which deceive people? And unless we start focusing on that, then I believe a lot of people will find that being outraged, they consider it worthy of their Christian calling. Now, he has since passed away, but I remember one woman telling me years ago that she doesn't really know what she should do in terms of the Great Commission, but what she landed on was that she listened to the Rush Limbaugh program every day.
Yeah.
That was her service. And she was, a nice enough woman, but oh my goodness, how deceived. She would be outraged at what he was outraged about. And then suddenly when you notice everybody has the same talking points, you have to ask yourself, isn't that interesting? That means that people aren't thinking for themselves. They're just repeating what they've heard.
You mentioned earlier the movie about Eric Little. What was the name of it? I forgot.
Chariots of Fire.
Chariots of Fire. And of course, that was a movie adaptation of some real life events that happened to him. And the movie, I think, brought it out reasonably well. But his first and foremost commitment was as doing mission work. And matter of fact, the man actually died in communist China not long, I think, before he was going to be set free. He had been, I think he was doing missionary work there during or around the time of World War II. So that, even though I think it was made to look at like it somewhat, that was not a glorification of Olympics. It was a recognition of one man who had a particular amateur talent as a runner. And there's a memorable line from the movie where his father says, you can glorify God by peeling a spud if you do it to his glory. Yeah, but that's quite a bit different than what we see going on in the modern Olympics. And, I think there's a sense in which, too, you and I both have a background in martial arts. Mm-hmm. I don't know in terms of your experience, but when I began training in the mid-1960s, the karate tournaments and the competitions, especially professional, were just really, they were few in number. Most of them were out there where you lived. And I remember being very ambivalent about these things because, you had your own inside your school, your studio competition between you and your fellow students, but you were part of a family, so to speak, in your training. But once you move it out of there into something where the whole purpose and focus is glory and self-aggrandizement, I want that trophy. I want to beat this other guy because he's from a different school or studio. It puts an entirely different spin on it that tends to exacerbate and feed into the baser instincts of our fallen natures, I think.
So let me tell you how true what you just said is. We started in the martial arts because my son, who was 5 years old, somewhere like that, went to a vacation Bible school. And there was this kid who kept beating up on him. And he went and told the adult in charge, who happened to also be the pastor's wife. And she said, Jesus said, turn the other cheek.
Oh, my.
So he came back and told us this. And my husband remembered something his father had taught him. Don't start a fight, but be the one who ends it.
Yeah.
Right. And so we signed him up for martial arts. Afterwards, I got involved in martial arts with the purpose of being able to defend yourself. So yes, there were sparring matches that would happen within the studio, but there was always a referee and people would wear headgear and they would have gloves that would, lessen a blow. But the purpose wasn't drawing blood. The purpose was learning how to protect yourself.
Right.
Well, this is not one of the better stories in the annals of Andrea, but there was a tournament that we went to against another school. Now you have to remember the age group of what we're talking about are people under 8. My son was definitely under 8 at this point. And our studio was going to go up against their studio. And so there was this atmosphere of us against them. They have to be the bad guys. You watch enough sports movies and you can villainize your opponent. Well, my son is engaged in a sparring match as part of this tournament. To be honest with you, Charles, I don't remember if he won or lost this thing, but I'm sitting on the sidelines and I'm going, get him, wipe him out. And then this person who knew me looked at me and said, get him, wipe him out. And I was just so shocked about what had come out of my mouth. I didn't know this kid. I didn't know his family. I had no idea. This was a competition to show competency in defending yourself and landing blows. I was so embarrassed because I had not hidden from these people that we were Christians and we went to church and blah, blah, blah. But that's what came out. And I really and truly learned from that sometimes the whole atmosphere is almost intoxicating, that the same way that you could be affected by something and not be aware of it, here I was. And when I talk about it, I'm still ashamed, to be very honest with you.
Okay. Well, yes, that's a prime example of what I was talking about. And it's an example in how even in a quote unquote pagan endeavor, there is a corruption of what good there may be. It's good to know how to defend yourself. And with that sort of thing, the example you gave and what I'm talking about, we're moving from the art of defending yourself against violence, which is a worthy thing to pursue, to something entirely different. And it's far removed from the issue of being able to protect yourself, your family, your children in a situation where you're maybe not able to run away or you don't have a weapon. And so there's a corrupting aspect to this that it looms massively large the further away we get from a biblical worldview, and even just from the further away you get from the purpose of, staying in good health and being able to defend yourself. So, yeah, the outrage is there when we see these kind of things like we're describing with the Olympics. But again, the question is, in my opinion, why? Why are you surprised? Why are you outraged at this? But also, what in the world are you going to do about it? You're just going to wait for the next one and hope it's better? Right. So these are tough questions we need to ask ourselves.
And really and truly, if you just stepped back for a second, yes, if somebody's going to hurt you, I used to give seminars on self-defense from a Christian perspective, from a biblical perspective for women, because at the time, women were being told, look, if he says, he's going to rape you, don't fight him off. It's better if you get raped, but it'd be better if you didn't get killed. Well, of course, that's not what the Bible says. The Bible makes it very clear that a woman is to resist. And if there's any indication that she hasn't resisted, then the assumption could be made that she was complicit in this was something she wanted. So the world was giving bad advice in that regard. And so the seminar that I would give, I would show some techniques on how to get out of holes. But the whole idea then wasn't to annihilate this person. It was to get out of there, because what you were trying to do is save yourself. But let's take it. Okay, so we now are watching assault and battery and we're going, yeah, this guy should win. Why don't we have competitions where we see somebody, can they successfully defraud the other person? Let's watch that. Or that a man decides to rape a woman and let's see if she can get out of it and how she does it. You see, by the time we are involved in these bread and circuses and watching our versions of gladiators, let us not forget that Rome fell because the people just didn't care anymore. And what they wanted to be was entertained. And then they were entertained by watching people killing each other or combating each other to the death, or watching animals destroy people. So what makes us think that what we do now is categorically different than what was going on then?
Yeah, and to just stay with that analogy, another reason Rome fell is because the people of Rome no longer knew what it meant to be a Roman. And by the same token, the application, I think, of what we're talking about is that what we're witnessing is people who no longer understand what it means to be human according to God's standard.
Yes. So this wasn't meant to, take people who are trying to excel at something and guilt trip them. It's just more of, I think, a warning in terms of think through why you do what you do, and then ask yourself, how does this glorify God? And make sure your answer isn't something that's a feel-good answer, but that's an answer that says, I'm actually furthering the kingdom of God.
Absolutely. I agree totally.
Well, the Olympics are now done, and we have to wait, 4 years before this next thing. But you don't have to wait too long. The Super Bowl is coming up and other gala events where Christians have the opportunity to be outraged. But let me just suggest, don't watch. Spend your time on things that are building as opposed to getting punched yourself over and over again and being upset that people are punching you.
Yeah, I'll challenge our listeners to, whenever one of these events you described comes on, just turn the TV off and go to chalcedon.edu and find a good video to watch.
There you go. Out of the Question podcast at gmail.com is how you reach us. And thank you, Charles, for the discussion.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thanks for listening to Out of the Question. For more information on this and other topics, please visit chalcedon.edu.